Hello, beautiful community. We are going to read and briefly react to a long note or a very short piece about Russia's moral catastrophe by the Russian author, exiled and criminally pursued and designated a foreign agent, Dmitry Glukhovsky. I've translated it for us because that freshness and organicity conveyed a bit from the original is more important, right, than the rapid time saving that ChatGPT would have generated for us. So hopefully this will be meaningful to us too, at the level of not just learning about the Russians and how they might talk to themselves if they talk to themselves better than they do, but about ethical responsibility generally. Tuck yourselves in, let's go. As it turns out, you can get used to anything in 1,000 days. Friends of mine visiting Moscow after a long absence tell me that the entire city is plastered with ad posters calling on people to go to war for 5 million rubles. My friends in Moscow have long stopped noticing this and believe they're living just as they did before. Many are convinced that life has got even better. Money is flowing everywhere, the restaurants are as packed as ever, premieres are making a buzz, and there is no respite from the Moscow jam festivals. And that's not a metaphor, he literally means jam or varenya festivals. Cities are covered with ads for contract killing, but people, except for the target audience, have learned not to see them. The target audience, 30,000 people per month, go to war for those 5 million, where they survive an average of 2 weeks before dying or ending up maimed. In 1,000 days, the war has become thoroughly normalized. The country didn't undergo an economic catastrophe, but it has experienced a moral one. The festive prosperity of Russia's capitals doesn't negate this catastrophe, it only highlights it. 1,000 days of killing innocent people in Ukraine, destroying their cities, 1,000 days of senseless casualties on the Russian side, 1,000 days of habituating oneself to silence and quietly abetting the authorities in barbarism, inventing rarefied excuses for war crimes, mental gymnastics that allows one not to feel aligned with evil. And voila. Russians now perceive those who have emigrated as crazy, naive, and preoccupied with idle chatter, simply because the emigres still feel, as they did 3 years ago, the horror and senselessness of this war. This war is a vaccine, going to get in trouble with YouTube here, against the perception of complicity in evil, allowing people to live with evil without getting sick. This war is an enslavement of the only free generation of Russians, who will now grow up to be the same Homo Sovieticus as us and our grandparents. So this business of skipping a generation is very sociologically important, because Putin had it in mind. He actually knew he was losing the younger generation. He wanted to kind of skip them and then create a next generation of young people who would be more compliant or more militarized or more depoliticized or whatever. We won't legislate on that now. Now, 2 brief observations before we sort of let this rest in us. Number 1. This is spoken into a much less developed public sphere, right? This is a Russian audience in Russia and in the West. A much less developed public sphere than the public sphere of a France or a Germany or a USA. That's to say, cultural interventions, including elite cultural debates and disputes, have less infrastructure around them, less platform support for them, and are more like private emissions of sentiment, often from private accounts of the people emitting these sentiments. So, to take a very minority sport example, if in the United States there is a dispute about whether Glenn Gould was an eccentric or a great pianist. That's a dispute that can be institutionally platformed by publications like the New York Review of Books, and can be allowed to exist over years, with voices coming out, making claims, and being in a structured way responded to by other voices. This difference between Russia and most big Western countries is, of course, a matter of degree, but it's worth pointing out that much more primitive, much more limited infrastructure-wise public sphere, and much the same is true, but for slightly different reasons, of Ukraine. So this statement by Glukhovsky is being emitted into a much more underdeveloped and primitive public space, which makes it more significant, actually. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing to say is, be careful about responding this, and this is a fraught time politically, so I'm going to be gentle. Be careful about responding to this with a giggle at the expense of the Ruskies and a couple of Zs in the word Russia. Because what Glukhovsky is doing here is saying, right, don't externalize responsibility. Because when you over-egg it on, let's giggle at the Russians who are in a worse ethical predicament than us, you're externalizing political responsibility and externalizing it in a way that could depoliticize you as a sideline giggler rather than a participator who says, yes, they're in a bigger mess than us, but it's also not just about laughing at their expense, it's also about taking us seriously. It starts with us always, right? Even with the bloody war. What did we in the West do to permit the global normalization and diffusion of that global network called Putinism, right? What did we do with the Iraq war? Even those of us like me and you possibly who were against it at the time, to break the global order. So the spirit of the Glukhovsky note here isn't for us to start laughing really hard at the Russians, but for us to actually say us, 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 us. Because when we do us, things get better for us. And we don't follow Viktor Orban's maxim that it used to be the case that the future of Hungary was Western Europe, but now it's true that Hungary is the future of Western Europe. So maybe I haven't been gentle enough, so I'll try better next time, but it was important for me to do this kind of centering. Thank you very much for indulging me with that. Lots of love.